So thinking about the biotech and the pharmaceutical industry, I wanted to give some perspective on that, as opposed to, we've had a lot of talk about hospitals and physicians. And so this is an industry that grew up, in fact, in clusters. You think of it today as a global industry, but it grew in physical clusters. It began in Germany, France, and Switzerland at a time when you had these close relationships of industry and universities, the creation of the first scientific industrial research labs, and kind of the growth of this industry. But interestingly, at the time, it wasn't like a market-based industry as we think of it today. They were producing, in essence, more or less generic-type drugs. The patent system wasn't what we have today. Post-World War II, this turned into an American industry. We think of today as the pharmaceutical industry as a relatively recent creation. And it was very much around patents on molecules, around research campuses, around medicinal chemistry as a science. And this develops into these vertically integrated, huge research-based firms that also do all the development stages and the drug marketing. And since that time, in the more recent period, we're in a period of upheaval. And this is where I say this question of what China would like. China's now training more PhD scientists than anywhere else in the world. So it's unleashing the creative potential. But will it have the market power? Will the drug companies want to not just do some selective research here, but will in fact the Chinese firms have the opportunity to become full-scale large pharmaceutical firms of their own? And I would say absolutely yes, the conditions are there, but clearly there are policy choices being made that are going to affect whether or not that can come into being. And so this is going to be my closing slide, and I want to say a few things. So one is, in looking at the pricing issue, right, so drug price controls are taking shape in a number of ways. The United States has put basically no price controls in place, is allowing free pricing of drugs, and is becoming the place that pays for the innovation for European countries that are developing reference pricing. So there, under a reference price model, you can say for a new drug, it has to be an average of the cost of drugs within a particular disease class, or you average it across multiple countries. Those are the two fundamental models at play. And the issue, of course, has been, this has been sustainable in Europe and other parts of the world so far because the industry is able to draw enormous profits out of the United States. But if it can't do that in the future, then there's going to need to be a real global recalibration. And frankly, we don't quite know what that looks like. But I think there is, again, sort of the opportunity for China to maybe spend a little less on U.S. bonds and a little more domestically on its own healthcare industry. So the question here is, what does China want? What will it become? And looking at this in terms of the current breakdown, clearly this is a hugely inequitable situation at present. Right? You can't look at this set of numbers and say this is how the world ought to look. How is it that a tiny percent of the world makes up 40% of drug sales in the United States, another 30% in Europe, when together they're barely 17% of the world's population? And how is it that that is the source of all of the research that's being patented? Now the patent data here I'm showing you is a little bit bad in that it's basically US-based patents. And so I'm still measuring this as if every new patent was issued in the US, which of course it isn't. And over time, we're going to be needing to recalibrate how we think about patents because a firm innovating in China may just patent in China and only later on look for a patent in the United States. So take this with a slight grain of salt, but nonetheless, the fundamental point is that this is a very unequal situation at present, but it's going to shift quite rapidly, I suspect. Now, it wasn't that long ago that people were predicting that India would be the place that clinical research all moves. Indian doctors speak English. They have, large hospitals. The idea was that all of the drug testing is going to move to India. Well, it hasn't. So that's kind of interesting. And in fact, if I showed you data from 5 years ago, the breakdown, the Indian role in the clinical trials underway would have been higher. So in fact, a set of policy choices in India and the fact that they did not create the same technical standards as are expected to get drug approvals in the rest of the world, has meant that firms have withdrawn or reduced the amount of testing going on there. So these are kind of national choices that get made, right? And so I don't know the answer yet. I'm coming, in fact, as I say, to visit for a year and teach and do research. But I think in a way like this is a fundamental question I have, is does China wish to develop a research-based pharmaceutical industry, or does it wish to basically spend its reform effort entirely on managing existing costs? Do you want to grow the pie, have an industry that has the opportunity to grow, or do you think of this purely as cost containment and cost management, in which case it's going to look more like India. It will be a generics industry, and some rich people will import the high-end branded drugs. And that's, to me, sort of a fundamental policy choice that gets made that will put China, in fact, on an institutional trajectory.